Love Thy Neighbour is the 8th episode of the 4th season of Cheers, directed, of course, by the brilliant James Burrows. And there will be spoilers from now as I discuss various aspects of the episode. And I have, of course, watched Cheers all of the way through before, and this is one of the episodes I remember really well. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that I just love Norm in general, so any story that focuses on Norm tends to stick out in my mind. But also because of the treatment of Norm and the character and the way he behaves, it's a little different to the usual typically passive attitude we get with Norm. He doesn't express his emotions that often. So when we see them like we do in this episode, it's really fascinating and really stands out. So I will go through everything chronologically pretty much and share my thoughts along the way. It starts off with a relatively interesting intro with Woody getting this order wrong for these guys, and Cliff thinks it's hilarious, and it's fine. It's funnier than I'm making it sound. It works well enough. Not one of my favourite intros, but no problems. We then get the first of two narratives introduced, and Sam is doing a Q&A on the radio, and nobody phones in to begin with. It's a little bit awkward, but then a question is asked, and Sam tells the story about, and I quote, a love bunny who once took a book to a Red Sox game to read to pass the time in between pitches. And it cuts to Diane, and based on her facial expression, she is, meanwhile, reading a book. We can tell that this is about her, as if there was ever any doubt. And my first thought was, what's wrong with that? I would do that. If I go to a theatre show, I make sure I've always got a book with me. I mean, I've always got my phone with me where I have access to ebooks. But reading in between the action is not that bad. Okay, maybe reading in between pitches is a bit extreme, but still, the idea of reading when there's no action going on is not the end of the world. To me, that's pretty normal. That's not to say I'd read during the slow times during a play. That would be strange. But reading in intermissions and things, that's perfectly reasonable. So I think Diane overreacted to the situation because she's outraged that Sam has told this secret to whoever's listening on the radio. And I don't think it's that big of a deal for people to know that. So I definitely think she overreacted there, and we see this a little bit later. After this, we are introduced to the story that focuses on Norm, and his neighbour, Phyllis Henshaw, played by Miriam, Flynn, comes into Cheers to find Norm, and she tells him that she thinks Vera and her husband Ron are having an affair. And this is a little bit surprising, and we get some descriptions of Vera throughout this that don't necessarily fit the Vera that's in my mind. For example, a little later on, Norm is reminiscing about the first time he saw Vera. She was a cheerleader, and that's not the Vera that I have in my head. And it's not exactly a problem because people change. There's no reason to say that she was once a cheerleader and now she's not necessarily as young and fit, as attractive as she once was, because that's reasonable, but it's just interesting to think of Vera that way, because that doesn't match up with the Vera in my head. But it was very sweet to see Norm reminiscing, and it's clearly bothering him. He phones Vera to try and say that this is just not the case, she's not having an affair, she's listening to a Johnny Mathis album. Norm reveals that they don't have a Johnny Mathis album, but Phyllis explains that they do. The thought there, of course, is that either Ron has brought over a Johnny Mathis album and he's left it there, or he's there at that very time with Vera listening to it together. And I don't think anybody wants to think that. Meanwhile, Diane is still seething about what Sam has said. She comes into Cheers, raging, really furious with it. And as I said, she's completely overreacting. Who cares if people know that she reads in between pitches? We also have to remember he didn't name her. So the only people who would know this are really the gang at Cheers. And I'm pretty sure the gang at Cheers don't care that she reads in between pitches. I think they probably expect that from her. So she's completely overreacting. Not that overreactions are unusual for Diane, but even this seems a little bit extreme for her. So the fact that she wrote Sam a speech to make him retract what he said on air was, even for Diane, a little over the top. But it worked well enough. That part of the episode was absolutely fine. Then the rest of the episode focuses on Norm and Phyllis. And when I said I remembered this episode really well, what I mostly meant was I remembered the scene in the back room, because they go into the back room and it's just Phyllis and Norm, and they're talking about getting back at Ron and Vera, and Phyllis says, "Fine, I'm going to have an affair." And they start to contemplate having an affair with each other, and then they have this kiss. And for about 3 seconds, Norm has just cheated on Vera. And I don't want to think that. I don't want to accept that that's something he did, that's something he was even contemplating. So it's not a great moment for Norm. But it is short lived, because the investigator they'd hired to investigate this comes into the room and he plays a tape. And we hear Ron and Vera talking about how they can't go through with this. And we hear Vera's voice. And again, it's not what I imagined Vera sounding like. So the descriptions of this in this episode of Vera do not match up with Vera in my head. It's not a problem. It's just something that was a little bit jarring every now and then. But it was certainly interesting to hear her voice. And also really great, of course, to know that if they were considering having an affair, they've decided not to, and everything will be fine for Norm and Phyllis. Because Norm without Vera, even though we never see Vera, is certainly something not worth considering. It doesn't surprise me that I remembered this episode really well. It's really great. That being said, it's not one of my personal favourites. It's not the funniest. I don't think I laughed out loud at any point. I don't need to laugh out loud to enjoy the episode, but there are some episodes that make me laugh so much. This isn't one of them, but I still had a lot of fun with it, and as I said, I remember it for a very good reason. It's a very well-written episode, a great look at a different side to Norm, and ultimately one I'm sure I'll remember for a very long time, and I'm sure I'll watch it again at some point. It's definitely a really good episode.